So, we're going to do something that may make you catch your breath a little bit. We're going to be a little political in our sermon today. Political. I know. I've been told most of my life, especially most of my preaching life, that don't be political. I'm not going to be partisan. I'm going to be political because Ephesians, that we've been talking about, Ephesians was political. It is a political book. I mean, most of the Bible is actually a political book. Because when we talk about politics, we're talking about how people organize themselves, how people work together, how people treat one another. That's really kind of at heart what politics is, what the political is. And I want you to understand that the church got in trouble early in its life for being too political. They didn't get arrested. The early church members didn't get arrested because they were too nice. They got arrested because they were too political. Let me explain. So we talked last week about a divided church. About how the early church was suffering, was kind of struggling through some real divisions over who to listen to. Should we listen to Paul, or should we listen to Apollos, or should we listen to one of these, as Paul calls them, super apostles, or should we listen to Peter? Who should we listen to? And of course, Paul would keep saying, like, don't listen to any of us, listen to Jesus. And Paul didn't save you. But they're suffering through a lot of divisions over kind of who they're listening to, their ideological fount, I guess you could say. They're divided over the languages they're speaking. They're divided over whether they're going to eat meat or not eat meat. But one of the biggest divisions within the early church, that first century church, was between those who were Jewish and those who were Gentiles. Jewish and Gentiles meaning basically non-Jewish people. I mean, look, the early church, as you probably know, the early church was a movement within Judaism. It was a movement within kind of an already established religion. All 12 of the original apostles were Jewish people. All of the original members of this group that was following Jesus, they were all Jewish people. But especially as Paul began to engage in his evangelical or evangelistic kind of trips, more and more people who had not grown up in the Jewish faith began kind of flocking to it, and so you had this faith that was now made up of all different kinds of ethnicities, all different kinds of backgrounds. People who were Jewish, who had been raised with the belief that there was one God, and that the people of Israel were that God's chosen people. And on the other hand, you had people who were raised with the belief in many gods. Those who were Jewish, they saw Gentiles as foreigners. Both groups saw each other as foreigners, as aliens. Gentiles were uncircumcised, which was the mark on your body of being one of the chosen people. The Gentiles didn't follow the law that had been handed down from Moses. They weren't part of the people, the chosen people. They came late to the party. And even the most tolerant kind of Jewish folks were like, well, I mean, that's great that you come late, but like once you come late to the party, you get the leftovers, right? While Gentiles flipped the script on that and saw Jewish people as foreigners just as much as they were seen as such. They didn't fit into the Roman imperial system. They were kind of prejudiced. They didn't eat with Gentiles. They didn't eat. They wouldn't sit down for a meal. They wouldn't accept other gods. Jewish people were called atheists because they didn't accept other people's gods. They were aliens to one another. They were separate. They were foreign. And so the author of Ephesians is basically addressing this. Ephesians says that Christ has changed this whole situation. That Christ has taken two groups of people who are foreign, who are alien to one another, and brought them together as one. Because look, first off, the author of Ephesians says, if anyone thinks that they are somehow more holy than anyone else, if someone thinks that somehow they deserve the richness of God's grace because of who they were or what they had done, that, oh, you are descended from Abraham, so you must be worthy, or that you are so open-minded, and so you must be worthy. But no, see, what Ephesians says is, if you think that you are holier than anyone else, you don't know what you're talking about. While Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians were arguing over who was further away from God and who was nearer to God, they had missed the entire point, because they were all far away from God. They were far away by the very virtue of rejecting one another. They rejected each other, and by rejecting each other, they placed themselves far from God. No one had earned their own salvation. Not those who spoke Greek, not those who spoke Hebrew, not those who spoke Aramaic, not those who spoke Latin. Not those who ate meat sacrificed to idols, and not those who didn't. Not those who had grown up going to the temple, and not those who had never set foot in Jerusalem. No one had earned God's love. Instead, what they needed to do, Ephesians says, was to realize that it was Christ's death and resurrection that had reconciled them to God. And that was something none of them had done for themselves. It was the empty tomb that had brought them all near to God. And bringing them close to God brought them close together. Brought them close to one another. It was God through Christ that had broken the walls down that separated all of them. They were now one people, one body, one group. And this people was not based on ethnicity or language or race. It was based on Christ's sacrifice for all of them. And it was for all of them. Because they all needed it. I sound like a broken record sometimes when I say that we live in a divided world. We do. I say this most Sundays, but it hasn't stopped being true. We are divided. I wish that I could say we are more divided now than we have ever been before, but read the Bible sometime. We've always been divided. We divide ourselves in every possible way we can do it. We separate ourselves from each other. We look suspiciously at those who are different from us. We divide ourselves based on our nationality, based on our party affiliation, our gender, our sexuality, our racial makeup. Politicians here and all over the world use our divisions to stoke fear and hatred to one another, just like they did in Rome 2,000 years ago. The point is, though, that we see each other as aliens. We see each other as different, as separate, as other, as foreigners. in those who are even the least bit different from us. But Ephesians cuts through all of this. The passage that we read today cuts through all of that. You see, Christ did not come into the world to strengthen our divisions. Christ did not come into the world to keep us separate from one another. Christ came into the world to bring us together, to transform us from many different people who hate one another to one people who love each other. Christ established his church not to be a safe building where you could hear a nice sermon once a week and gather with people who were just like you, who talk like you and dress like you and act like you and believe all the same things that you do. See, we were created the church. We have been created to live out a new political reality. One where we treat one another differently than how the rest of the world treats each other. One where the divisions that the world seeks to create between us are overcome. Christ's death and resurrection have closed the distance between God and us. They've also closed the difference and the distance between one another. God has seen us in all of our imperfections and all of our screw-ups. And God has loved us so much that God has become one of us to live and to die and to live again, to show us the new way to a new kind of life, to give us the power to live out that new kind of life. A life where we love each other despite, and even more because of our differences. Because if God has loved us, even when there's no reason for God to do that, how can we do anything else? If God has loved us, how can we not respond, not just by loving God, but by loving each other? Through Christ, God has sacrificed everything for our good. We were strangers to God, but God has brought us near. So what if we were to do that with each other? To bring one another near. Because in Christ, there are no strangers. In Christ, there are no aliens. In Christ, there are no others. There are just children of God. And we are called to live that truth that is made possible by the death and resurrection of our Savior. Let us show the world what that looks like today and every day. In the name of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We are bold to pray today and thankful